Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking.
Today we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose. What are the books that we're cozying up to this autumn?
On my list, I've got the page-turning but questionable Run by Anne Patchett and the invigorating must-read My Phantoms by Gwendolyn Riley.
For me, it's non-fiction that's been keeping me turning the pages of late, with Merlin Sheldrake's revelatory mushroom book, Entangled Life, and Patrick Radden Keefe's essay collection, Rogues.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review.
The Questionable Run by Anne Patchett. I mean, we have to start with that. What's questionable about it?
Well, so I like an Anne Patchett novel. She's super readable. I remember State of Wonder. I loved that. I would recommend that.
I feel like everybody loves Anne Patchett, don't they? She's really revered writer, book world
and
person.
especially she owns a bookshop in Nashville. And she has this Instagram account, and my friend Caitlin, who's in book club with me, says she just wishes Anne Patchett was her literary godmother. She's just so warm and funny, and the books she recommends are really interesting. So it's so strange then that this book is really problematic.
Is it a recent release?
It's not recent. That was one of the first things I kind of got to about a quarter of the way in. I was like, wait a second. It was written in 2008. I think that's right. So after her success of Bel Canto, there was a 6-year gap between Bel Canto and this book. Have you read Bel Canto?
Yes. The one about the opera singer in Brazil. Really good.
Yes, the hostage situation. Just great. She comes up with these really amazing scenarios and then kind of picks at them, usually quite deftly. This one, just to give you a sense of what it is about, I'm going to read the little blurb, only because it teases enough and also not quite enough. Since their mother's death, Tip and Teddy Doyle have been raised by their loving, possessive, and ambitious father. As the former mayor of Boston, Bernard Doyle wants to see his sons in politics, a dream the boys have never shared. But when an argument in a blinding New England snowstorm inadvertently causes an accident that involves a stranger and her child, all Bernard cares about is his ability to keep his children, all his children, safe. So, the first thing is that Tip and Teddy, when you are the two sons, I read that and was thinking we're talking about little boys and he's going to have to keep them safe in that sense. No, they're like strapping young men of 22 and 24. They're also adopted. And while their father is a staunch white Bostonian and the mayor of the town, they are black. They also have an older brother who is biological son to their mother and father, who's not mentioned. And it's the race thing. It is the race thing that is so problematic. And I cannot imagine any scenario where Anne Patchett would have written this in the last 4 or 5 years. Because the color of Tip and Teddy's skin, no problem, Kate. Like, don't even worry about it. Because once you're adopted into a white Bostonian family, race just disappears and everyone treats you perfectly well. And there's not going to be any issues whatsoever, both internally within your family or in terms of how you are perceived within this white upper class community. The only reference is that their elder brother, who has gone off the cards but loves them deeply. There's one scenario when they're kids where he like beats up some other kids for talking about their race. And so it's all just so unrealistic based on, I think, what we've heard. I say we, as white middle-class women, what we've been able to learn from the Black Lives Matter movement, and crucially, more diverse voices being published. But this story written by a white woman from Nashville, I'm like, oh, I don't know, Anne. And then there's this melodrama, which is quite fun in some ways, around the accident. And there's a reason why this woman has pushed Tip out of the way of the car and in turn been hit and severely injured by the car. And so her daughter then gets taken in by this family briefly while their mother's in hospital. There's an unnecessary ghost sequence where the mother talks to a former friend in the hospital who's a ghost, and there's a revelation where you're like, why is that even in there? I flew through this book. Anne Patchett tells a wonderful story, but it is definitely not her finest. Now, that said, I wonder if this review is intriguing enough for other people to go out there and give it a shot.
And have you looked at what people are saying online? Is anyone else picking up on the same sorts of things that you were worrying about?
It's interesting. I don't always feel the need to do that, Kate, but I know you like us to see what the World Wide Web says and check in. And, the reviews are universally positive, but I would say this book was written in 2007, and I think the conversation has moved on since then, and rightly so. I did find one reviewer, all I've got is her name, Ruth, on Goodreads, and she sums it up much more eloquently than me. She says, "Here is a case of why you should write from your own experience. For Anne Patchett to tackle writing about adopted Black boys, about racism and poverty was a travesty. There was no semblance of reality in the characters she drew, and she simply paid lip service to the tenements alongside the hugely affluent neighborhood of the ex-mayor." She's in a book club, so this is a book club discussion that I've jumped into, and it's very civilized. I like it. So people are saying, well, do you have to have lived experience? I thought it was really great writing, etc., etc. And Ruth says, oh, well, I hear ya, I get it, and maybe I'm just being a bit grumpy. And so she says, not everything has to be about dysfunction and strife, but I wanted this novel more grounded in reality. The problems you mentioned were problems any family could have. So this is around adoption and the biological son who's off the rails, etc. Ruth continues, but this was an unusual situation. 2 African-American kids raised in an affluent white family in an affluent white neighborhood nudged up against a poverty-ridden Black neighborhood. That's a really loaded situation, and one which seemed to have left no stress or conflicted feelings among the participants or their friends and family. Hard for me to swallow that. And that really resonates with me. I mean, I would love this book to be an accurate portrayal of this situation and this family, but it felt like wishful thinking, and that these young men would have had a much tougher time in that situation.
This is reassuring me about my general policy, which is if I read a book by an author that I love, I tend not to seek out anything else they've written, because I'm just always a bit nervous that another book in their backlist might not be as good, or it might somehow undermine the experience of the one that I read and loved. I think we have to be careful.
I think we have to be careful too, because there are a lot of Anne Patchett fans out there, and I think I do remain one. I just think this book is not her best. I've read The Dutch House more recently and thought that was cracking and really good. Safer territory.
I was just looking up to see if I could see anything current about it. Often I turn to Amazon customer reviews, and I was thinking the other day, why don't I like Goodreads reviews? Like, you would think they would be the source, but I find them suddenly had a slight epiphany the other day about the difference between Goodreads and Amazon, is that Goodreads reviewers have a Goodreads account. They are, by their very nature, bookish people. There's a real sense of community and people writing reviews so that other readers will read them and be able to find out about a book or share thoughts about a book, or, almost like book club exchange. But also I always feel there's a slightly performative element to those reviews on Goodreads. They're often very long and incredibly articulate and, really brilliant, but it's a slightly different agenda. And what I quite like about Amazon is that they're just customers. Anyone can post a review on Amazon. And, often there are things like book arrived damaged, sent it back. But, there's kind of a whole thing about that where then if they award the poor author 1 star, that really affects their rating. So the whole thing is incredibly problematic. But there's a certain straightforwardness, I feel, to an Amazon customer review that doesn't have a real bookish agenda attached. And so often I think for debate and to really pick up on different views, they're my first point of call.
So what does it say?
St. Mary's gave it 2 stars, found it hard to read as it seemed to go on and not really get anywhere. Didn't give up and read it to the end, but unfortunately it didn't get any better. That's a very honest response.
I'm on Amazon.com, which probably has different reviews.
Yes, I would imagine it does. I'm looking at UK.
Everyone is loving it.
Well, interesting. This is a US one. Lily McLeod gave it 2 stars. Said, I just finished reading Run for my book club. I had heard of Bel Canto by reputation, so when one of our members suggested Run, I thought, how bad could a book by Anne Patchett be? I was wrong. For a story that takes place over a 24-hour period, there were far too many themes: adoption, race, politics, family relationships, issues of nature versus nurture, religion, death and loss, etc., none of which could be fully developed. Some of the plot twists were incredibly unrealistic, to the point where they diminished what Patchett was trying to accomplish. I finished the book simply because I was curious about how it would end. However, for me, it was not worth reading. 9 people found that helpful. I mean, it sounds to me, though, I bet that probably was quite a good book club discussion they had about it. You know, good but flawed is often a good...
Yeah, or entertaining but flawed.
You know, often what you want for a book club book. All right, well, that sounds like a bit of a miss, but listeners, if you've read it, drop us a line and let us know what you think. If that was a miss, I think I had a hit. I finally read Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life, which is a book about fungi. I always call it the mushroom book because so many people told me about it. I had this idea about, oh yeah, there's this mushroom book. It's supposed to be really good. So finally, I got round to reading the mushroom book. It is absolutely brilliant. Everything that everyone says about it is true. It is such a wonderful read. It is so fascinating. I mean, I really did feel like there is a revelation on every page. They just keep coming. He's giving an overview of a world that we don't really ever think about. It turns out that it's not really even mushrooms in particular. The mushrooms are just the way that fungi reproduce. So they're like the tiny little tip of the iceberg. They're the bit that we see. And under the ground, stretching beneath our feet, are these networks, these fungal networks. And they're what's really interesting. Mycelium, I think they're called. Vast, complicated, interconnected networks that we don't really understand very well, or scientists don't really understand very well. But the more they find out about them, the more important they realize they are. They enable plants, which we tend to think of as the main event. We see the plants and the trees, and so that for us is what we think is important. But actually, it's this incredibly complex fungal network underneath the soil that is sustaining the plants and even creating the soil in the first place. It's so important and so poorly understood. In my copy, almost every page has either a folded corner or a little bit underlined or something that really made me think. He says, fungi provide a key to understanding the planet on which we live and the ways we think, feel and behave. Yet they live their lives largely hidden from view, and more than 90% of their species remain undocumented. The more we learn about fungi, the less makes sense without them. And in that little quote, you get something else that's very pleasing about him, which is that he is a really wonderful writer. And what he's very good at is putting things into words, different aspects of the scientific research that's been happening, and then weaving in this philosophical strand that's really delightful, which is really considering our place on the planet, our relationship with the things around us. There's such a fascinating thread about how, in order to even try to understand the fungal world, he found he had to let go of a lot of preconceptions and ways of thinking. And what's wonderful about this as a reader is that he allows you to share some of that open mindset and different ways of thinking about things and different ways of viewing the world. And it is so exhilarating to encounter. It really does make you sit back. All your thoughts about the way things are fly up into the air, and when they fall back down again, they're in a slightly different pattern. And I just was really so surprised and delighted by it. It's a really wonderful read. It's very hard to talk about because it is quite technical. There's a lot there. It's hard to sum up. And I suspect it won't be long after I've finished it before I start forgetting all the little details. At the moment, I keep talking to people about, you know, whatever it is that's freshest in my mind that I've just read about. As soon as I see someone who doesn't know about it, I'm like, oh, did you know, by the way? Yeah, so it's that as well. It's got that lovely conversation starter element. It's really fun to discuss it with people.
I have a fun fungus fact for you.
Yes.
You know the alternative meat protein, corn?
Yes.
American listeners, that's QUORN, corn, not corn. It is a fungus. It's a bit of a shame. I feel like because it is a fungus, like if you know too much, you want to eat it less. But the history of it is in the 50s and 60s, lots of people know this. There was a concern that with population boom, we were all going to starve to death. And then there was the Green Revolution and so forth. But during that period, there was a scientist who was looking at fungi to see if there was something that could be turned into an edible food. And from that research and testing came corn, which comes from a fungus and then is fermented like beer. And now the sad thing is I can't actually eat corn. It gives me indigestion, but it is quite tasty in the scheme of things.
Yeah, and it's funny because that one's been around quite a long time, hasn't it? Because when we were growing up, my sister was vegetarian and my mum used to make her spaghetti bolognese and she used to use corn instead of meat. And it basically tasted exactly the same. So...
Yeah, no, it's been around for ages. It was it wasn't really meant to be a veggie alternative. It was meant to be an alternative food group to save us. So anyway, I'm into it. This sounds like the ultimate cake book.
Yeah, well, the only other thing I'd say is it can be quite disturbing. When things in my life seem hard, to put things in perspective, I can feel grateful that I'm not a carpenter ant, because there's a kind of fungus that basically preys on the carpenter ant. And what's interesting about it for Merlin Sheldrake, and indeed other scientists, is that the fungi infects the ant. That's probably not quite the right word to use, but it sort of appropriates the ant. Maybe that's the best way to think of it. It makes the ant, because ants, apparently these kinds of ants, they don't like heights. And it makes the ant climb up to the very, very, very top of this plant that the ant is near, which is not typical behavior for the ant. So the fungus is making the ant behave in that way. It makes it climb up to the top. Then it makes it bite into the stem of the plant, tapping into a vein, a source of nourishment. And then it grows out through the ant's feet. So it then fixes the ant to the stem, and then it grows out through its head, which is all fairly horrifying to read, because you're just like, oh my God, the poor ants.
Basically zombies.
I mean, exactly. This whole chapter is about zombie fungus. And but what's extraordinary about it is, how is the fungus doing it? It's actually controlling this creature's body. It's
really?
not doing it through its brain. It's basically invading its nervous system. It's so interesting, but mainly you just feel grateful that you're not a poor carpenter ant. And the worst thing is, that's reasonably early on that you find out about the carpenter ants, and I was sort of disturbed by it, but then the book moves into other areas. And then it gets to the photo section in the middle, and there are these pictures. Felt like way too many pictures of the poor carpenter ants, basically in states of being impaled by the mushrooms growing out of their heads. Oh, God. So anyway, yeah, it's quite a startling book for many reasons.
It sounds like a great book club book, especially because it's the type of book I would not read unless your book club read it and I was forced to read it, and then I would be very grateful.
It would be
full of fun facts.
A fantastic book club. As I was reading it, I was thinking this, because every single chapter has got something in it that you want to discuss, and it's such a good read. He's one of those people, every so often someone comes along who is a scientist or an expert in some particular field, and they are also a really wonderful writer. It's quite rare, but when it happens, it's magical. And this is absolutely one of those books. It's great. It's really great.
Okay. So you're all nonfiction. I'm all novels. That's pretty par for the course for me anyway. The next on my list is My Phantoms by Gwendolyn Riley. And I have to admit, this was a book club book, but I don't think we're going to discuss it on the show, and it must be discussed. So I'm slipping it into
Well, I would quite like to read it, because I've heard good things about this.
It is brutal, but in this exciting, invigorating, shocking way. It's very simple. Our narrator is talking about her relationship with her mother. She paints her mother to be a certain kind of person, and you're very much on the narrator's side. And then there's sort of little moments that flare up where you're thinking, wait a tick, that seems a bit unnecessary. Like, she will only see her mother once a year on her mother's birthday, and she complains about it being in February in the rain, and her mom will come down for this occasion. She won't let her mother meet her partner, who she's been living with for some years. You get the sense the narrator's in her late 30s or 40s. And so your allegiances, they don't necessarily shift, but your perspective changes dramatically as you realize that actually the narrator is as much at fault, if not more, as the mother. And so you have this real character study of these two women. I don't want to say they're locked in a psychological battle. Certainly the narrator thinks they are, although you're never quite sure if the mother's on the same page. All of this action, in quote marks, really happens in conversation and in dialogue. What I said to my book club was I just felt like I lived their experiences. I felt like I was in the room as they're having a cup of tea. And the drama is so high and recognizable, I think. You know, I have a very good relationship with my mother, but even still, there's just something about the domestic interaction with your own families where every phrase has a different meaning because you guys have known each other for so long, right? You know everything about each other. Really good. Not at all the kind of book I would choose to read myself, but I would highly recommend it. For book club, yes. But I think it does qualify as a cozy read because in some ways it's not very challenging. There's no depressing climate news in there. There's no violence.
There's no zombie carpenter ants.
No zombie carpenter ants. So yeah, really exciting read.
And she's a British author, isn't she?
She is British, yeah.
I'm very interested to read it. All right, a bit more nonfiction. You would like this one, I think. This is by Patrick Radden Keefe, who wrote the book Empire of Pain. which was amazing, about the Sackler family and the way that they made their money through OxyContin and profiting from this epidemic of addiction to pain medication that has spread around the world. And before that, the reason I knew about him was because your book club did his book Say Nothing, which was on the Troubles in Ireland, the IRA, really following through one family's experience and why that might have happened, the sort of whys. And, you know, it was an investigation, wasn't it? But he's really brilliant at putting you there in these situations, bringing these people to life. And he's incredibly well-rounded, I think, in the way that he tells these stories, so that he really does the research, so that you really do see all different sides, all points of view, and can make your own judgments as you read along. Rogues is a recent release, and it's a collection of 12 essays that he has written over the years for the New Yorker magazine. And the thing that unites them, sort of, I mean, it did feel a bit, what's the word, tenuous, the link, is that these are all in some way shady characters. There is one who is a kind of, she was the sister of a mobster. That whole particular story takes place in Amsterdam. He was this Dutch mobster. He and his brother were basically sort of the crime lords. She was a lawyer, so she used to look after when things got too close to him. She would make them go away and had all the legal expertise. And so she knew every aspect of his operation. And then she decided to testify against him and as a result put her own life in danger. And so she is now living in hiding, and he goes to see her and hears her side of the story. And so in some ways it's kind of very niche. We're here in the UK, we're not that far away from Holland, and I certainly had no idea about any of this story, which is ongoing. Certainly to American readers, I feel like it will be even more remote.
You know what my first response was, and this is very naive and has much to do with national stereotypes, but it was like, a Dutch mobster? The Dutch are mobsters?
No, I think that's fair, actually. When I started reading that chapter, I was a bit like, oh, in Holland?
It's such a civilized country. They've even legalized so many things that are criminalized elsewhere.
I suppose wherever there are human beings, there's going to be good and bad. But yeah, no, I agree. That was also what I thought. I've been dipping in here and there. And actually, one of the nice things about this book is that you very much can do that. So I've read the ones that piqued my curiosity. There's one actually that I really wanted to read. It's the closing essay of the book, and it's on Anthony Bourdain, the chef turned TV personality, I suppose, travel journalist, just an extraordinary man. I mean, those programs, I don't know if you ever watched any of them, but they really were something else. It feels like they were in a class of their own. And I thought it was interesting that Patrick Radden Keefe, who I feel as a writer is somewhat in a class of his own, was drawn to finding out more about Bourdain. I really wanted to see what the marriage of those two people would be like. I think one frustration I have with it a little bit is that I think having experienced what I think of as sort of pure Patrick Radden Keefe, so Say Nothing and then Empire of Pain, which were two long, involved books, compared to those, this feels to me somewhat dialed back. And I thought, you know what it is? It's like New Yorker style. You know what they're like, New Yorker pieces. There is a certain quality that New Yorker essays have, which I love. I absolutely love it. It's a very special publication, I think, because the journalism is so fine and the quality of the writing is so fine. But there's also just something about them.
Aloof?
There's a certain tone or quality that's a little bit uniform. And I felt in these essays that I was getting Patrick Radden Keefe, and I was also getting a bit of this. I was getting a bit of that New Yorker voice.
It might be the New Yorker editor, right? I feel like if you're a journalist or a writer, you are probably going to let the New Yorker do what they will.
Well, he acknowledges that he worked with someone who he's worked with for a long time, and that person was very important in helping him find these stories. And so acknowledging that there was a real working relationship there. It's not even really a criticism. It's just, I suppose, the only thing I thought is, it is a bit different. If you really loved Empire of Pain, or you really loved Say Nothing, and then you came to this, I almost wonder whether you would find it satisfying. There's a slight sense of, they're fine. They're perfectly fine. And they're good. I was thinking as I read them, each one could be a movie. There's something very compelling about each story. The way each one is structured pulls you through. He brings these real life people, real life situations to life. And yeah, you feel like each one you could sit back and watch as an hour-and-a-half movie, and it would be a very interesting, enjoyable experience. But yeah, as a whole, I think when I was looking online, by and large, the reviews were good. Lawrence J. Wall gave it 5 stars, said each profile was well researched and engaging. I especially appreciated the absence of editorializing. The author let the stories speak for themselves. While Cardi gave it 5 stars as well, said, I just love reading all of these stories, some of them so unbelievable they could only be true. But even the most corrupt and morally compromised subjects featured here, the author has a real skill in getting the reader to identify with them and feel empathy for them. Stories exhaustively researched and succinctly told. But then Reflective only gave it 1 star. Said, thank goodness the future is female. This boring book was a grind to get through. Having loved Radden Keefe's previous books and eagerly awaited this one, I bought it on the day of publication. It immediately felt like a publisher trying to cash in on Keefe's wave of success. What else have you got? Oh yes, give us all those magazine articles. We could make them into a book, etc., etc. These relentless tales, almost all of men, show us how business, politics, finance, the law, entertainment, and life generally have been run by male ego. This book made me glad to be a woman. And now I'm glad that women are breaking through and largely changing the very principles and ethics of how things are done.
Because we're so good. We are flawless. Women, aren't we great? We never do anything bad.
Yeah, I didn't think that, and I haven't read enough. And I wonder, again, if you sat down and read the whole thing just cover to cover, maybe it would start to seem a bit relentless. For me, definitely, it did feel like it had been packaged up into something that I'm not sure it really was. And I think you have to take what you get, which is 12 quite different, really interesting, well-written essays on different people that each has its own merit. I mean, the only other thing I thought was, it was always slightly depressing, you know, while they're not all criminals or wrongdoers, you know, Anthony Bourdain, for instance, you know, certainly doesn't feel like he belongs in that category. There's also one about Trump that's about the man who produced The Apprentice. Can't remember his name. He came up with the idea for The Apprentice, the original Apprentice in America. And he happened to have made this connection with Trump and realized that Trump would be the perfect larger-than-life person to play the top boss. And so he pitched it to Trump, flattered him, said he'd make him look marvelous and all of this. And Trump agreed to do it. And they, both of them, were co-producers of this show. So both of them made millions from it. And what Radden Keefe is making a case for is the fact that the way The Apprentice depicted Trump as this successful businessman, as this powerful man, as this man that you would want to emulate, and 12 people, I can't remember how many it is on The Apprentice, you know, competing for this amazing chance to work for Trump. All of that really fed into then this myth that, it's no stretch to say, powered him to the presidency. But for all that, he's not a criminal, this person. He is a Hollywood person who had a good idea and made money from it.
But isn't that what's so great about the word rogue? To the reviewers' criticism, there's no female rogues. It's gendered, that term. You have male rogues, lovable rogue, right? They might be on the edge of criminality. They might dabble in criminality. They might be criminal, but there's always a sense of charisma and bravura. Is that how we say that? Which is distinctly male. Elon Musk, I would say, in his own way, is a bit of a rogue. Can you imagine if a woman did the exact same things that he did or is doing right now with Twitter? The world's mind would explode and they'd call that individual hysterical and so forth. Anyway, I go on. But yeah, there's something about rogue which is distinctly masculine.
Yeah, well, maybe. So yeah, it's another one I think I would definitely recommend it. I am enjoying it very much. I'm dipping in here and there, and that's quite nice that you can do that. Every time you just feel like you want a little bit of Patrick Radden Keefe fix, dip into another one. And I think another one that would be good for book club. If your book club is inclined to try a bit of nonfiction, this one would be great.
Well, I'm intrigued. I am intrigued. I don't know if I'll read it. I think I still haven't read Empire of Pain, which my dad has taken on holiday with him. And I'm curious to know what he thinks of it. My dad has quite a lot of faith in human nature and always thinks that things aren't quite as bad as, or, you know, like, oh, there's probably another side to that story. And I feel like Empire of Pain, it might be like, nope, no other side, Dad. Just bad people making lots of money.
I think he'll like Empire of Pain then, because that feels like what Patrick Radden Keefe does and allows you to do as a reader is to really understand the motivations of these men, these 3 central figures, the original brothers, particularly Arthur, who is the eldest. It's sort of terrible what he did, but at the same time, you really understand his motivations for doing it. And it's, I think, his particular skill as a writer that he can do that. He can really paint a fully rounded portrait of people that allows you to see the good and the bad in them.
Shall we do What's Next segment now? Mainly because I want to talk about what's next.
As in what's coming up for you, what you want to read next.
What I want to read, or what I've started to read. I want to report in.
Uh-huh.
So, without further ado, I have been circling Elizabeth Gilbert's City of Girls, her novel about a young woman at an elite all-women private school, a university, Vassar. And she gets kicked out and her parents don't know what to do with her, and they send her to live with her aunt in New York City, and her aunt runs a theater. And so she's cast in with these characters and showgirls. So I've been circling it for quite some time because I don't mind Elizabeth Gilbert's novels. She is the author of Eat, Pray, Love, if you're having a hard time placing her.
That's the only one that I've read.
We read one of her other books, I think maybe her first novel, which was about a naturalist in the 19th century traveling the world. I think she goes to Tahiti, and it was a bit melodramatic, but quite fun. I've started this book looking for something light and frivolous and fun, and I keep getting stuck. Everything about this book should appeal to me. It feels frothy fun, but so far there's no, what's the word? There's no tension. Where is this going? What's going to happen? So I might keep at it, but alternatively, I am circling My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk, Turkish winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Have you read this one?
No, I've only read that awful one about the love affair with the girl. What is that
by
called?
him?
Museum of Innocence? Something of Innocence.
And was it awful because of the subject matter or awful because of the writing?
No, the writing's great. That's the problem. It's not that he can't write. He writes very well.
Hence the Nobel Prize.
The Museum of Innocence? It's such a doorstep, and it's about a man who conceives this enormous passion for this fairly young girl. I can't remember, she's sort of 19, 20, something like that. You know, she's not underage, it's not that, but she's significantly younger than him. And he's just obsessive about her. He's completely obsessive about her. And I can remember things like he sort of climbs up the outside of her house so he can reach into her window and take the cigarette butts from her ashtray or something and hoard them. I mean, it's just weird, I thought, and a bit creepy. And it is an amazing portrait of a moment in time and the city. And, you know, he's a fine writer. But I really did not like this central character or the central relationship. And it's a long old book. And if you really don't like the main element of the storyline, you're not going to enjoy it much. But then I found out that there is actually a museum of innocence that exists. That is a museum that's a collection of all these little bits of ephemera, like the cigarette butts or some keys or different things collected together. And I can't remember now, but when I read about that, I thought, oh, that's wonderful. And I like the book so much more for having this extension, you know, in the real world that sounded really fascinating. So then I felt like, oh, did I misjudge it? Perhaps I did. But so as a result, I've never been moved to try and read anything else by him. I think Phil's a fan though, isn't he?
Yeah, Phil is a fan.
Phil, our favourite sometime guest on the pod.
I feel like everyone knows Phil. If you don't, catch up, listeners.
Someone out there might be listening to this podcast for the first time. They'd be like, who's Phil?
Shout out to Phil. My mum said to me the other day, I think I'm a little bit in love with Phil. Oh. And I was like, well, you know, join the club, Mum. We all are.
I'm in love with Phil.
Anyway, Orhan Pamuk, My Name is Red. It's another historical novel. I wanted to draw a parallel between My Name is Red, which is a historical novel that starts with a narrative voice speaking to us on behalf of their corpse, which is lying at the bottom of a well. And I gather that if I keep reading, I'm going to understand what led to his murder. He was a miniaturist. I believe he was experimenting in the European style, which in 17th century Istanbul is seen as heresy and an affront to Islam. I may have got it wrong. Maybe the person who killed him was the one illuminating books in the European style. Because as I say, I'm only about 30 pages in. The book that led me back to this one is Ahmet Altan's Like a Sword Wound, which we discussed on the pod a year or so ago, and is a historical novel set in Istanbul right towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. We loved that book as my book club. And I feel like Orhan Pamuk, especially at least with this novel, has something of that really lush, dense, almost what we would equate with Victorian storytelling. And so I want to keep reading this one, obviously, rather than City of Girls, which isn't even delivering the fun froth I'm looking for. But I don't know. I'll have to report back. What are you going to read next?
I might read The Marriage Portrait by Maggie
Oh, yeah.
Which I have been almost holding off on because I just feel like it's going to be such a experience when I do. And I'm, that thing, I'm always wanting to save it. And it's funny because I feel like Maggie O'Farrell is not an author I could ever read lightly, because I know her books are going to take me somewhere emotional. And I suppose in a way also I've been a bit hesitant after all the Booker reading, which is, it's such an intense reading program to do that and read so many really powerful novels one after the other. For me anyway, because normally I like to mix up my fiction with non-fiction. So yeah, I felt I just wasn't quite ready to dive into something like Maggie O'Farrell. But I'm getting there. Now I've read The Mushroom Book and a bit of Rogues. I'm nicely detached. I'm ready. I'm ready for some more fiction.
All right, listeners, so you never know. Those books might be discussed properly on an upcoming show. But for now, that's it. That's all for this episode. Books discussed were Run by Anne Patchett, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, My Phantoms by Gwendolyn Riley, Rogues by Patrick Radden Keefe, City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, My Name is Red by Orhan Pamuk, and The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell.
If you enjoyed this show, check out our website, where you can find our archive of over 120 shows to browse through, including our recent Booker Prize special episode, where we discussed this year's shortlist. You can also explore our library of book reviews and articles, sign up to our newsletter, and coming soon, news of our very first Patreon account.
In the meantime, if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do and want to support us, please do take a moment to rate and review the show and help other listeners find us. Better yet, share on your social media channels.
But for now, thanks for listening.